Welcome everybody to this afternoon's panel. OpenUK is the UK organisation for the business of open technology, being open source software, open hardware and open data. You can see the past sessions that we have done in this series at openuk.uk/security, and this is the last session in our current series of talks. All of the previous talks are available via the video upload on the website. We have had Kate Stewart on supply chain security and software bill of materials, Nicholas Chalin on Department of Defense and securing defense, Brian Bendelhoff on the US experience, the Open Source Security Foundation and the White House, and shortly this session. We will also be sharing a series of podcasts throughout August, as well as hosting an event on the 19th of September after the Open Source Summit in Dublin, looking at infrastructure, curation of open source and security. Anybody wanting to participate should contact admin@openuk.uk. And thank you for your attendance today. Please put any questions as we travel through the panel into chat, and we will prioritize questions from the audience. And I'm very pleased to welcome our panelists today. We have Dr. Jackie Taylor, globally recognized as the world's first smart city SAR and a strategic advisor to UK government, as well as a whole raft of other experience. She's recently taken an appointment in the UK Cabinet Office to create the open standards for the UK government and is an expert advisor to the United Nations for the 2030 plan. And Sonia Mossett, a senior security advocate at SNCC and lifelong traveler living across the Middle East, North Africa and Asia. She's passionate about open source, DevSecOps and cloud computing, as well as being the founder of Epic Women in Cyber and Epic Women in Tech, two initiatives to showcase women in the tech and cyber industries. Welcome to you both, and thank you very much for joining us. I am Andrew Martin. I will be your panelist for today. I am CEO and founder at Control Plane, where we perform cloud native and open source security consulting with a focus on regulated industries and government and security audit and testing. So let's jump in. The end of last year saw a dramatic Christmas for many security engineers as we furiously patched the Log4Shell vulnerability. This was an encoding issue in a package used by thousands of projects and caused a number of sleepless nights for everybody from critical national infrastructure maintainers through to Twitter, Facebook, and the general open source consuming community. So, starting with you, Jackie, have we learned anything from Log4Shell?
I think the world has learned about us in the way that we've never managed to get in people's consciousness in quite the same way. I don't think any of us were surprised at the impact of it, because we all know what we do is embedded across the world in every vertical at every level in terms of the stacks. But I don't think it was in consciousness of particular sectors or specifically government of just how embedded that was. And I feel that what we've learned is the fragility of the supply chain. That is a good thing. I mean, arguably we learned some of that in pandemic, but that particular incident focused people's minds in terms of it can't just be there's a stack and some components are open source, we maybe have open hardware in there, etc. It's actually all part of it's literally sprinkled across the world. So it's everybody's problem now, not something that we in our maintainer communities need to focus on, but it's actually for all of us now. So for me, I think that was the key thing that we learned, and it brought the awareness and the focus to what we do and how much of what we do matters across the world and how embedded it is. And that for me was not before time. I would prefer it didn't happen that way, that we'd made the case and we'd said, look at this, and we're matured as a community and what we do, and look how we're enabling you to all do what you do every day. but it was what it was. And I feel that that fragility of the supply chain, in fact, the entire value chain, was the thing that we learned the most about. And of course, there's various initiatives kicked off, which I'm sure we'll talk about later as a result of that. But for me, that was the key one.
Yeah, I think it did start some conversation and awareness around securing open source softwares. Also for the companies, it made them more aware and starting discussions on what dependencies, what packages, what kind of software they're using internally, and using and having actually implementing tools to have that visibility and fixing kicking for the log4shell. But also I think on the maintainers and contributors, it highlights the work and the constraint that they might be working under pressure when the companies are going back to tell them to if they could fix also the packages. So having a single maintainer of a project that could be used by hundreds of thousands or millions of softwares, the hours of contribution that they're having outside of their working hours, mental health also have been raised during that period because we know they had to ship features as soon as possible. Potentially by missing some skills around securing their software. They probably don't also have time for that. So yeah, having also that discussions around the maintainers is also a good one that potentially have been shown with the log4shell incidents.
Yeah, absolutely. The fragility of the supply chain that we now all see sort of brought into stark relief, but by extension, yeah, the individual efforts and often thankless contributions from the individuals who push all this code, often without the support, the kind of asymmetric usage of the producers versus the consumers. We'll get onto that question with open source and supply chains later on. Take a moment to appreciate the fact that those individuals do much of this work from a position of a labor of love. I guess to continue the question of the supply chain then, how do you consider the open source landscape has changed since the invasion of Ukraine, Sonia?
So at Sneak, we've looked at what we call a new trend with protestware. So protestware, for those who are not aware, is a term used to describe packages that are altered in some way to protest against a certain event. And we're talking about the Ukraine situation now. So these alterations are not being made by hackers or otherwise malicious actors. They are often made by known and respected members of the open source community who are active maintainers or contributors to large-scale open source projects. And it can actually be conveyed in different ways. So you could potentially have a repo banner. So just on the README file, you would have the protest, which is written on there. You could have also through your command line, but you would have also more destructive protests. We had the example with the package node IPC that was overwriting files on disk with protest information. We also have another package called Peace Network, and that module was adding a message of peace on the user desktop. And this was based on the geolocalization via time zone vector. So if you were based in Russia, it will overwrite and tamper with your machine. So this is something that we've seen lately with the Ukraine situation.
And from a counterterrorism perspective, Jackie, is there a shifting in mindsets or risk models that we have to observe with the open source landscape since the development of hostilities?
Yeah, I think there is, and actually it was interesting. I mean, obviously we've done a lot of support for that during pandemic, as we've all had to mobilize in ways we haven't before. I mean, Fly Binary was founded in 2009 as a virtual only organization, and although we do have offsite enclaves, ListSecs, that type of thing, we largely worked in a pandemic style world since 2009, and so we had a number of requests, interestingly two types actually, from companies in Ukraine who were during pandemic asking how they might mobilize and what tech they could use, and we used some of our counterterrorism intel to advise on that. But then secondly, Series H funders well, normally we work in Flying Binary from Series C and D, which are 100 million plus funding. We're seeing an increase in their portfolio from Ukrainian tech companies embedded in that value chain. So I'd already done a risk assessment around what that meant for portfolios and the funds themselves, but that actually gave us access to some of the tech companies in Ukraine. But so some of those contacted us before February 24th when Russia invaded, to say, we're seeing this mobilization, we think it's real. And so we used some of our counter-terror tools to really validate that. And so we had about 2 weeks to mobilize some of that. Where we are today, we have 300 organizations, unfortunately not all on soil in Ukraine anymore, across 20 countries now, 15,000 people who've had to effectively step up to what that has meant for themselves. And obviously the key thing was keeping the lights on. And sometimes that meant that they couldn't stay in Ukraine. And obviously the UK government being fantastic about getting fast track visas. If UK companies had Ukraine teams to be able to repatriate them here, even temporarily bring families across. But essentially what we've seen is we now have a network that operates in plain sight that nobody in the Russian Federation has access to, that enables us to mobilize. So we mobilized in a different way on Monday because, based on the Ukrainian government's sort of foresight piece, we know that we're approaching massive issues from the onset of winter. We need to do some of that planning there. And I think that from a tech point of view, we now have those, all of the Ukrainian tech sector all in one place, all able to be mobilized off the platforms that anybody else might use to infiltrate. But it's seen that we've been able to do so exercises, just give you an example, rescuing children. Some of the orphanages that they were in have been bombed more than once as they've been moved around, some very sick children as a result, etc. That's actually enabled us to connect some of the, not just open source tech, any of the tech, and actually lend a hand and understand a humanitarian need that has been passed on to the Ukrainian Red Cross, and then UNHRC has been on the ground as well. So I think I've never seen, from a counter-terror point of view, because we're treating the Ukrainian war as that, something that actually mobilizes our open source communities alongside everybody else, become much more of a connected tech ecosystem, and we're able to mobilize, message, have emergency process, which we would do in our counter-terror war. We wouldn't normally have others in that. So I think Ukraine has been awful, let's be honest. The first time we've ever had to deploy from space what we've been doing. That was always there to be done, but you know, where's the necessity? But it's actually given us an advantage in a warfare situation. And I did some work with 67 of the European leaders to talk about how that mobilization gives us a new perspective on what we might do. And again, I go back to what I said at the beginning, this is a sort of a maturity of the open source agenda, where we're seen as an enabling agenda for situations just as, I mean, I'm not sure they can get direr than this. This is the worst. And also it's across the European landscape. It's not confined in a geography. So it's the first time we've done at Flying Binary some of the work we've done outside of the counter terrorism domain, but actually utilizing and leveraging open source capabilities in order to do that, and mobilizing it and that capability across quite a large network.
A really fascinating range of different perspectives there. I mean, I guess starting with the risk of open source code being used to make political statements, but then balanced against the fact that despite some of those sort of negative press and sort of elevated risk, we've actually seen open source, as you say, as the agenda has been considered more mature, being used to expedite very difficult remediations to a complicated problem. I think there's a secondary part to this, which perhaps we'll get onto as well. The national affiliation of an individual has led us to perhaps wonder, instead of know your customer, know your contributor. And at what stage does that put us into a situation where we are, to be frank, discriminating against an individual based on a risk rating of their sort of national affiliation? And certainly we have seen that with, I guess, the sanctions from a very high level, which paint the entire country as a unit, but also increasingly with a view to understanding which line of code has come from which location. And that leads me on to my next question. This concept of national affiliation, how has the use of open source in critical national infrastructure changed as a result of that affiliation? And I'll come back to you again, please, Jackie.
Yeah, so this has always been something that has been, as we moved from a threat landscape to a risk landscape, we've always had that focus. But of course, what's happened more recently is that's been focused on a territory and then the ongoing risk and impact elsewhere. And so that national affiliation, again, in some of the sort of loose coupling that we have in what we do in open source, that is a vulnerability that we haven't really considered in quite this way. And I would say that we haven't in Flying Binary seen such adversarial use of that in the way that it's a new focus and a new form of that. You know, in terms of if you look at the increases in ransomware over this year, and you know, emergence of new groups and what have you, that would be something that we would be prepared for and we would understand, and then be able to sort of check that out across our ecosystem. But this one has been particularly difficult, and specifically the two. So there was an emigration of some of our contributors pretty much within the first month. They were landing in probably about 9 or 10 countries and then saying, we need help, and how can we get connected back in? Because they already were visible in Russia, and the fact they did what they did made them more visible and therefore unsafe. But we're seeing now there's a second wave of contributors where there's been they perhaps haven't been on the radar, and they've used the time, because we're entering our 6th month in the next week, they've used that time to prepare for the fact that longer term, the work they do in open source can't be from where they are, and that national affiliation is an issue for them and an issue for clients. And so we're seeing a planned migration happening in the last 2 weeks or so, which I'm looking at and thinking is going to be across the summer, and particularly those with families who are settling in new countries. And I think that we need to do more on this one, particularly to support the contributors, because this has been an interrupt level that none of us were really focused on, and has had some really serious consequences, and and as a result of that has impacted what we all do. So for me, this is something that we're working on every day to support those contributors, but I think we need to mobilize something else to say, and how should we treat this going forward? Because this is in my view, this is something we need to pay attention to. But it's a daily conversation at my end of things at the moment, particularly the second migration we're seeing as the summer unfolds.
Thank you very much. And Sonia, do you see this with Snyk, the affiliation of a maintainer or contributor affecting the risk score of a package?
I think if I go back to the protestware, that could be potentially an example. If we were talking about affiliation, this was more on protesting and showing a different level. Should it be on just running files or tampering with the device? But yeah, potentially this is something that we're actively monitoring and looking to and flagging, just to give visibility to the organization that this is going on within the community, and potentially can be a risk.
Thank you. And moving now from potentially international contributions to a national one in the US-centric sense, In terms of malicious or vulnerable contributions to open source code, the Linux kernel suffered an interesting academic attack, let's say, whereby researchers and academics from the University of Minnesota decided to see if they could ship intentionally vulnerable code into the Linux kernel. This signals somewhat of an adversarial mindset, potentially against maintainers of open source. Could you perhaps give us another example of where this mindset against maintainers is beginning to shift?
Yeah, sure. There was this this package called Event Stream, and this was 4 or 5 years ago, and it was implemented in. It was a dependency for a JavaScript package, so a sub-dependency. And the maintainer was looking for contributors, as always, because this is community-driven. And one of the issue that was raised is adding a feature, and if that feature was added, the maintainer would merge that that additional piece of code. So what the attacker did actually go through all the issues and found that as a potential entry point. He did push cosmetic changes, so changing some line on the README file, pushing some CSS code, just to build up the trust with the maintainer. And when he earned that trust with the maintainer and got higher permissions to push code, he actually pushed codes, a malicious code to that was directed to a Bitcoin wallet called Copay. So this was really targeted attack, but nonetheless, it actually interfered with a lot of Node.js packages, and the community actually saw, because it was also impacting package called NodeMon, and it was slowing down a lot of the servers. So the community actually flagged this and said something was wrong with one of the dependency, and this is how they actually could have a look and pinpoint the issue. But having this social engineering methodology used on the maintainers is something that we should also have a look at, because the methodology is the same as any other attack that could happen. And yes, I thought it was an interesting one actually to use that methodology to social engineering the maintainers, just taking the time to go through all the issues and see if there's a potential entry point and building up the trust, because they do have time. Actually, it could range on 1 month to 6 months. That I guess that they have time to do this. So yeah, just taking those tactics and techniques to social engineering maintainers is quite frightening, I'd say, for the community.
Yes, I strongly agree. And Jackie, are you seeing an increase in the submission of malicious patches to open source code from a supply chain perspective, or are they more generally perhaps typo squatting or social engineering attacks?
Well, I'm agreeing with Sonia on this one. I think that there is a push or a focus to actually find the sort of weak spots, and I'm not so surprised that they went after maintainers first, because I think that that's, you know, in some respect that's more hidden than something new that we're building together, and it's much easier to do it. But those tactics are very similar. I mean, a human is at the core of most of the attacks, you know, in terms of from a security point of view. It's not just an open source problem, and the idea that was a deliberate approach. I think we should, from my point of view, we look at this world from an adversarial point of view. If we're going to be at least on the case with this, or hopefully a step ahead, we take that approach. But I don't think as a community we do. That's quite standard in counter-terror, but we don't as a community. And I think that this is part of, you know, one of the reasons from an OpenUK point of view, from a board point of view, we need to look at some of these things and say, well, how can we contribute? What do we need to provide to say, well, how do these attacks, what you should be looking for, and probably build some capability, more than awareness, education, produce resources, this sort of collateral where people can plug in and see. But we need a bit more of an understanding across our communities that this is actually set for the future. I think the fact that that's perpetrated means that that will be seen as a new attack vector, and we need to defend against that risk and give people the resources that means they know how to deal with that. Because it's, for me, the reason we move from a threat landscape to a risk landscape is really you can't defend against the threat anymore. You have to decide on which risks you're going to mitigate and how. And I think that that's the missing piece for what we need to do for our communities, is to help them see that some of these things that have appeared, how we would, what we need to do, produce resources, what education we might need, and how we would help support them, effectively be on the watch for this as we always are, and then bring that capability across the ecosystem. I think this is one of the really key things we need to move on.
Fantastic pair of points there. I think the threat to risk landscape is something that I see personally in consulting. Ultimately, the breadth and the breadth of technology and the depth of abstraction and layers that we depend upon means that it's very difficult to entirely secure everything. And really, as you say, modeling the threats and identifying exactly where it makes sense to apply controls in a quantified basis with an order of precedence is the most impactful way to secure our systems. Okay, thank you very much both. So moving from an academic perspective into a state's perspective, we've seen some of the US administration's movements into open source, be that from a mandate perspective, from a financial support perspective. Is it the state's place to incentivize open source maintainers to patch security holes in their products? And this is not only for suppliers into government and critical national infrastructure, but also potentially secondarily more widely. That's for you, please, Jackie.
No, this is, I'm on my soapbox now, Andy. I'm sorry about this. This is where I think we have the opportunity to mature what we do, and we have to lead the efforts on this one. It would be a really nice thing to say, well, government should, but actually we need to make the case of why that would be. And I also think that we've had always a for-purpose model in what we all do. You know, we do this because we believe in it, we know it matters. And then there's been, in the recent years, a for-profit model move in, as some of the companies have been, I'll use the term we use in the community, hoovered up, and a for-profit model applied. And actually, I believe it's time for us to say, well, yes, for purpose, because I don't think any of us would disagree with that. Yes, for profit, but we need to combine those approaches and say it's for profit and for purpose. And therefore, we'll put the case as to how we would do that. Now, I know we do in our companies, and many companies do, but I don't think that we've really made the case for the fact that there is an opportunity. There's a gap developed as a result of all the recent events that mean if we were to take the initiative to say we're setting up for purpose, because that's where we've always been, we're adding a for-profit piece, what that would give us as a commercial model is the money to scale what we do. Because we tend to be purpose-led, not necessarily profit-led, then I think where we are is it restricts what we can possibly create. And we are more dependent perhaps on particular individuals than perhaps we need to be. We don't have depth in numbers. If we had more of a for-profit model on this, then we would get that depth in numbers. And in fact, some of the lack of sleep everybody got over Christmas would be a thing of the past. But I think as a community, we need to make this change. We need to step forward and say, it's time. And if we can do that and then show the benefits of it, create that approach, I think governments will back it, because there's no easy way for a state or a region or a national government to get involved in this. And we're a little bit of an amorphous mass. And so if we take some of the mystery away of this and make a case for it, I'm sure we would get that backing. And Alpha Omega is one of those ways where we need to do something, but let's not have it as a single action. Let's have it as part of a new wave of how we enable open source to do what it does, but make it more robust and have our depth in numbers, which we don't now.
Yes, absolutely. And the project you referenced there, an OpenSSF initiative, the Alpha Omega project, Amiga perhaps, was launched in February to distribute funds and support maintainers of open source software. Do we think that the UK is capable of the same kind of response, Sonia? And indeed, as I heard somebody on the project suggest once, is it possible to turn money into security?
Yes, this makes me think of I don't know why, by bug bounty for the community, raising vulnerabilities and getting paid for that. That could potentially be something for the open source community, and potentially push more security research or hackers to raise those potential vulnerabilities in the software. But to come back to the Alpha Omega project, it's a good start to have those investments. I think it was up to 5 million for 10,000 projects, which is a good start, because it's I think it's targeting the 10,000 biggest or most important projects. But what about the rest that also are implemented within hundreds, thousands of projects? Yeah, so it's a good start, but we need as a community to push forward and have it to cover everything. So that's why probably the bug bounty model could be potentially one. And if the organization also could help on that by sponsoring, also be part of that bug bounty model. Just an idea.
Yes, absolutely. I know from seeing a few bug bounty programs, I think the European Union actually sponsored one a few years ago. Often where these initiatives fall down to some extent is the contribution of security vulnerabilities does not a patch set make. And ultimately, the maintainers then again have that responsibility to triage, do the work. And again, we will get onto this nicely segued into a later question on the curation of open source. So Google's attempt, obviously they are part of the, and it occurs to me that I guess Amiga is probably the Britishism of the Greek. And from the government's perspective, we should probably be trying that. But the Google are part of the OpenSSF and therefore sponsors of that foundation and project. But they've taken a slightly different approach. And Eric Brewer's keynote at the Open Source Summit in Austin last month introduced this concept of curated and assured open source. This is the process that Google are taking of rebuilding open source projects on their own secure build infrastructure. There is a community-led initiative called SALSA, which is supply chain security level and assurance. And the goal of that project is to help to define what a secure build system is. Now, Google are then saying, we have a secure build system and we will use that to rebuild open source packages. We have done assurance on our compilers. We have done detailed assurance on our build infrastructure. And as such, we can securely build these projects. Where they take that to the next stage, so that to some extent is the assurance, the curation then becomes patching of code. So it's this concept of almost running a bug bounty, but not only discovering the bug, but also fixing it, building and making that available to their consumers, and then simultaneously pushing it back upstream to the package. This is not a revolutionary approach because Red Hat do something a little bit similar, but it seems to me that the depth and breadth, again, that they are attempting to cover with these things it is really quite significant. So I wonder, Sonia, do you think we need a curated open source approach to secure the open source landscape?
I guess it's a good starting point to have that list of curated secure open source projects. I was looking at the announcement because they had the Google Cloud and Flink collaboration also on that, where it was integrated within the Google Cloud to flag the vulnerabilities, and as you mentioned, going back to the maintainers to have it fixed. But I guess that's a good starting point to have a curated open source solution that could give potentially guidance and guideline for organization to use.
Any thoughts, Jackie, on
Yeah, I mean,
integrated?
I do think that what Google are doing is a necessary thing. Like you say, it's a similar thing to Red Hat. The only concern I have is the word curation. I would prefer it to be orchestration, because that is inclusive of our communities. But I understand, you see, this is where a for-profit push gets us to curation. If you did a profit for purpose model, it would get us to orchestration. Google would have its place, but we'd have an overall orchestration to sort of respect the wider ecosystem. I think it's going to happen. I don't think any of us can do anything about that. It's a question of what our response to that is. And certainly I very much welcome Google's move on this. I'm a Google engineer and I work in this space on GCP, and I think that this is necessary, but I hope it's not where we end up, like a big tech version of all of this, and then what happens to the rest. So that's really why I want to look at orchestration, not curation. We need something as a community alongside this that says, and how do we make sure that this isn't just for the benefit, a for-profit benefit, but it's the overarching purpose isn't lost. So, you know, we've had all sorts of IP issues. Let's not go into those, but around the Microsoft changes with their, you know, use of GitHub, etc., that we've all been involved in just recently. And I think that that's the danger if we get into just curation. I think that can be a great start, and I very much welcome what Google are doing. I would say, what as a community are we going to do to amplify that, to bring our for purpose element to it? So question marks for me on that one.
That's a fascinating point, and I guess harks back to your profit for purpose point earlier when talking about state sponsorship. It strikes me that yes, absolutely, this is at risk of becoming a walled garden, as we've seen with perhaps mobile device stores and increasingly with desktop app stores as well. Perhaps we would find the middle ground whereby the incentivization for open source maintainers it is based on a commercial model, as you say, with some of this contribution in from the large organizations. Again, I have this sensation of asymmetry when small producers, and there's the canonical XKCD with somebody in Nebraska supporting not a Rube Goldberg, but some fantastic contraption just with one little stick. And while we are seeing things like GitHub handed out, I think $500 to a number of individual open source projects over the past couple of weeks, almost as a kind of reciprocal thank you for making a platform successful, and also all the consumers that use the product. Certainly I agree that some middle ground between ownership of the entire problem space and a good faith effort to play into the maintainer's journey to maintain secure code is where we'd like to find ourselves. Okay, thank you very much. So moving into a standards perspective, when do we think open source standards around software packages and libraries help or hinder us in the pursuit of secure development, maintenance, and usage of open source software? Sonia, one for you, please.
Sure. So we do have standards for contributing to the open source project. So should it be how to create your first commit? There's a code of conduct. There's some sort of templating when you're contributing, for example, on GitHub, because we're referring to this. So having those templates and code of conduct just to let you know how to interact with contributors and maintainers and the repo, that's the open source standards. But also what would be interesting is to have those standards and best practice also around security. So for GitHub, for example, they do have a GitHub marketplace where you can actually add application and create a basic pipeline, CI/CD pipeline, where you could implement security tools. So you could have tools around if you have credentials, also to flag your dependencies, to scan your code. So having those at every steps and reproduce that pipeline within the your open source project. It doesn't have to be a fancy pipeline, but just to flag at those stages. And also the good thing is those applications on the GitHub Marketplace are free for open source and public repos, so the maintainers can actually implement it quite easily and start building those. And also having best practices around hardening your open source project. So implementing 2FA, making sure that you protect your main branch, making sure that you're giving the right permissions to the maintainers and contributors. So having those best practice and guidelines would be a good thing to have, and it's missing in the open source ecosystem at the moment. But as I said, it should be quite easy to implement, but also I think there's a lack of awareness of these tools. Probably like awareness, if we're staying in the GitHub ecosystem, people don't know about the marketplace. They don't know that they can implement those tools and they're free for open source. And also they can potentially have bigger plans or team plans if they have a bigger open source project. Companies are also willing to support on that. So yeah, having that visibility and that education piece around that is also something that probably needs to be a highlight.
Yes, an excellent point there around some of those project hardening pieces. There's tooling from the OpenSSF, for example, around some of the CI best practices that allow us to statically analyze these things. But as you say, the security awareness of a lot of open source maintainers is not the reason that they're successful. We ultimately often have a dichotomy between the success of the project and its sort of its commercial applicability and the desire of an individual to ship security changes and features, which I don't think will ever entirely go away. And yes, yeah, excellent points. Thank you very much. And Jackie.
Yeah, I just wanted to come on that. I mean, I completely agree with you, Sonia, and I think that we need to look just at the motivation of this. It needs to be, this is where I get to my orchestration point, because actually what we need to do is make the case of to why this would make what you're doing a USP, why this would deliver on purpose and on the purpose that we all have. And I think that the Ukrainian example and the things we talked about earlier is part of this. You know, we have, there is a responsibility to what we do to make sure it is not used in an adversarial way. And that's where I see a role for OpenUK to make that case. In taking the position in the Cabinet Office on the Open Standards Board, that actually validates the work that the Cabinet Office team are doing with experts in open and experts in standards, and in my case, in both, and brings best practice and challenge, but also looks at opportunity. And I think the orchestration has to have that for-profit type opportunity in here. And that there's no reason in my mind why the UK can't have a leadership role in that. Let's make a case for it. Let's pick something that we believe is going to be important. But the thing that I always do with my engineers is they do a portion of what they do because that's what we need to do. And then we always have a sort of an approach that says, good ideas come from everywhere, especially from you. What would you do to make a change? And then we would challenge that within the teams and all decide to work on something specifically. If we could get something that's a start point or a real need, or something where we say, for maintainers, this is your USP, whether it's, you know, the marketplace or something, this is how you, it's almost like your legacy of what you do is because you step up to this piece. Security is a USP for what any engineer does. And I would argue that with anybody. I'm welcome to, you're welcome to take me on that one. But I've proven that given the impact of what we can create and the communities we support. So I think this one is actually our opportunity in our community to make the case on this one. And what might we do? And because there's so many people that would have so many ideas on this, we would open it up. And I think that this is another area where possibly the state would see some value in this. But back to sort of the Open Standards Board and Cabinet Office, what we're using there from an open standards point of view is challenging models again, because what we use in most of government is some proprietary, some open, and a mixture of anything. And what do you end up with? And what does the impact of that have? What is the value chain of it? What is the fragility of that, etc.? So we're looking at that from a point of view of those open standards are adding value, but they're not proprietary locked in. And so that's making a case on an open standards point of view of lifting the value of what we all do by utilizing open standards in that. And it's interesting of the ones that we've already authorized, how interconnected the delivery of those standards are and the maintenance of those standards are in the way they're not for what we talked about open source software. So there is already an ecosystem that understands the USP of this, is getting government backing from it for standards. And so I know that there's an opportunity for us to do that with software. And that's happening in the UK, world first, to be able to do that. And so I'd like to use some of that model and bring to life this orchestration. And I feel really strongly about this, that if we negotiate that orchestration based on our for purpose model, but put the profit piece in there in order to scale what we do and equip the ecosystem for security, not only will we create that impact, but we will actually move what we do to on a level with anybody. Arguably, you know, this will be our USP. So off my soapbox now.
It's a wonderful vantage point from which to listen to you, so thank you very much. I think by extension, we have this, this question of beneficial ownership, which exists, again, sort of in the pursuit of secure open source. It may play back slightly into some of those previous questions about national affiliation. Do you have a view from your security practice, Jackie, how easy it really is to see who's in control of an open source project?
No. So what am I doing about it? So people will probably know that the UK's created the Economic Crime Bill as a result and legislated as a result of where we are in sanction regimes and set a new goal for, you know, our financial system. And I think that some of that work is applicable here. And effectively what we've done on that is we're able to tell you anywhere in the UK who is the best beneficial owner of any organisation in the UK. We can do that today. We've been able to do that since about a month after the bill went through Parliament. I think we need something similar. Now, it doesn't have to be onerous. We've probably got a toolkit that we can mobilise. The question I always have with this is, who needs that? And I think I would find that a hard sell in our community. So then we're back to which is the piece we need to do to say to the state or whoever else, this is our contribution, where's yours? And then we lift everybody. I see this one as a real issue that doesn't have an obvious way of tackling it, although I do feel we do have all the tools in the toolkit, we just haven't assembled that or made the case. And I've had so many conversations around this since, you know, sanctions and that, you know, rewriting the controls over the financial system. Well, isn't this an issue for us in terms of, you know, what we've seen happening and what we were talking about before, the adversarial side of it? And the answer is yes, but I don't believe it's really a resonant conversation at the moment. And that to me is a risk we need to at least focus on, even if it proved to be a little bit difficult to deliver.
Absolutely. And Sonia, I recall from the Node.js Express package that kind of passed hands and was sort of bought by a private entity at one point. That there was a huge ruckus around that. That's probably the last thing that I can remember where obviously a commercial entity took visible control of an open source project. I guess this kind of crosses back over into the previous question of contribution as well. Are there things that you and your organization see which are helping to kind of unmask these contributions further to the previous question?
Yeah, just to echo what Jackie said, it's quite also tricky to have the lists of every contribution by line of code. It's also the essence of the open source. Everyone should be able to contribute without blaming or flagging one specific line of code. There are some tools that actually list the maintainers and if there's any new contributor. So we could have that visibility, but sometimes it's hard because they might be using specific usernames, or how do you link to a physical person? So there's still these questions around that.
Thank you. And I know one of the OpenSSF working groups, I think named Developer Identity, reached a stalemate at one point when the question of whether a journalist or an individual in perhaps an authoritarian or repressive regime should be linked to a physical identity by virtue of cryptography or something like this. The goal perhaps is to help prevent collusion, where the same person then registers two accounts and gains trust on the same repo and is able to review their own pieces. I agree, as it stands, it is an interesting problem to face, and we have to rely upon on deep level things like code review and making sure that we actually run our static analysis tooling. Again, flying a small flag for those things. Right, so one of the questions that we see coming into the last 5 minutes or so in open source these days is this question of a software bill of materials. And this, to put it briefly, is almost a recipe for how to construct a library, or in fact, an actual package. But of course, both a library and a package will have their own list of dependencies. How much do we see this in our day-to-day? And do we have a view on who should be required to ship an SBOM from open source packages all the way through to closed source vendors? What do you think, Sonia?
That's an interesting question. I don't have the answer for who should be required. I would say everyone, open source vendor, clouds, you have that visibility, but also the main question is, how do you aggregate all those SBOMs? What do you do after that? How do you fix those vulnerabilities? Because it's great to have visibility, but what do you do after that? And if you have SBOM from all of your open source dependencies, vendors, cloud, there might be a lot of information to digest for the security team, for the engineering teams. So it's more about what do you do about all those these SBOMs afterwards? How do you digest all of that information? Yeah.
Absolutely. It is almost sort of death by 1,000 lines of metadata. Any thoughts, Jackie?
Oh, definitely. Not the thoughts that you've got. I'm an aerospace engineer. I grew up in bill of materials. I learnt my trade, 20,000 parts going into sub-assemblies and assemblies. And so I actually was one of the very first software engineers in the aerospace industry. So I know it can be done because I did it over 30 years ago. The fact that we don't look at things like this is really the problem. And again, you know, how do we describe the value of it? How do we start to mature what we do to make it rigorous? And I do feel we miss out on a lot by the fact we have this total freedom on things, which I'm fine with, but the price we pay is some of the problems we have today. And I think at a very basic level, what we are missing is a transparency overview of this. And I think probably it will come from the private sector because it'll be demanded of us if we don't mobilize and do something first. But is it difficult to do? No, I did it, 40 odd years ago on mainframe computers. So it's really not. And in fact, we're more equipped to do it now. It's just we're not focused on it. We don't see the value on it. But it's changing practice. A lot of things we talked about today are changing practice. Do we really want to create the impact we can with open source across the world? I'm sure every single one of us would say yes. Are we prepared to change our practice to make that happen in a secure way? That's the question. And so I think it's going to be down to those of us that do leading those of us that will. And that's really my focus. My focus on the open source, on the OpenUK cyber board is, I know that this needs doing. Who will come on that journey? And I guarantee in the same way when we invented the term software engineering for aerospace back in the 1970s, it became an entire industry that gripped the world and got us here today. are we going to be bold enough to do the same for open source? And why wouldn't we? The impact of what we could create, and then authoritarian regimes and the rest of it could go do what they want to, but we'd be mobilized, wouldn't we? Now, why wouldn't we? Is there any bigger purpose than making sure Ukrainians can call the soil they stand on today their own? And that's what we've been doing since the 24th of February. I know that's what mobilizes us all. I know that's what the back of why we do what we do. But we do have to, I mean, somebody said to me on Monday when I was doing the next steps for Ukraine, we have to grow up and say, actually, this is necessary and it's not our favorite thing, but let's do it, because look at the price we pay for not doing it. Look at what we could gain by doing it. And I think that's the sort of argument we have to have, and the conversation we need to bring in order to go, we won't all go forward. Maybe it's an 80-20 rule. Maybe 20% of us go, you know what, going to do that, Jackie. But then, you know, we'll lead the charge the same way we did in the beginning of all of this, because it's really where it's got to go.
Yes, I mean, thank you. There's being driven by a sense of purpose and duty for a higher purpose is indeed what motivates a huge number of contributors in our community, and is a sobering thought when we consider the alternative of inaction, perhaps. Right, so just we'll finish on one final question. Large organizations often find themselves, when adopting open source, as inadvertent producers. So from a consumer producer perspective, we often think, well, my supply chain, the open source code that I ingest into my organization and that my applications are constructed of, make me a consumer. But as soon as we start to build any sort of integrations or perhaps helpful libraries that might help with a small, well-isolated problem and publish that on GitHub or on a package registry, we may drift into this open source producer mindset without a core motivation. I wonder, Jackie, do you have any advice for organizations or indeed the government that might find themselves in this position, and how to address the problem from the ground up?
It's going to happen. So, you know, just start with that's where it's going to be. And my advice is always don't drift into that. This is a consciousness thing, and set up the mechanisms for mobilizing on that basis. You might want to choose how you do it and on which projects, etc. But actually it is going to happen. And I think the fact that we don't have that producer mindset generally in an organization, it will bite you later. So why wouldn't you do that? And again, we look at career paths and we look at the opportunities that unlocks. But it's often the thing that, you know, people say, I got here, I don't know how. Well, because you started as a consumer, everybody gets to here. So I think partly just the fact we talk about it today, going, that's where you'll get to. Do you want to maximize the opportunity of that, or are you just going to drift there? And when they do drift there, they've got to do something about culling that back and understanding what that means. So I think it's just inevitable.
I agree with the inevitability of open source. Sonia, any closing thoughts?
Yes, I do agree with what you just said, and also it's the fact that organizations don't have that producer mindset, with probably missing career path education, those opportunities that would actually push more engineers to participate in that track. So I completely agree with what you just said.
Could I just say one final thing? I'm not actually going to give the numbers because they're horrifying, but I'm sure you know, you probably know this as well, Sonia. When we talk about our tech industry and about the diversity and inclusion agenda, which we've clearly failed on a yearly basis since forever, when we look at it in our open source community, it's far, far worse than our tech industry. And I think there's something to be said for, even if you were to tackle that piece and give some support to be able to be more inclusive about our communities, then we would get some of the benefits of what we've threaded through here. The fact that we are so poor at an inclusive community to deliver the changes we're talking about, some of that gives us the unintended consequences that we've talked about.
Completely agree on that. Yes.
Well, huge wells of gratitude and thanks for both of your time today, Sonia and Jackie. Some insightful points to take away and think about there. And thank you to everybody who has attended. We will upload this alongside the rest of our series of talks up to openuk.uk/security. And of course, sharing that series of podcasts throughout August. Please watch out for our event on the 19th of September. Infrastructure curation and security. That would be in London. And thank you once more to everybody in attendance, and have a wonderful rest of your day.